Welcome everyone to our book club on Palestine Meet the Author session with our guest, Dr. Peter Shambrook. Dr. Peter Shambrook is an independent scholar and a historical consultant to the Balfour Project, which works to advance equal rights for all in Palestine and Israel. He specializes in modern history, the modern history of the Middle East, particularly the role of Britain in Palestine during the early 20th century. Peter Shambrook holds a PhD in modern Middle Eastern history from Cambridge, and over the course of his career, he has held a number of research positions, including at Durham University and at the Center for Lebanese Studies in Oxford. He's the author of French Imperialism in Syria, 1927 to 1936, and of The Policy of Deceit, Britain and Palestine, 1914-1939, the book we are focusing on today. Politics of Deceit examines the crucial but controversial 1915-1916 correspondence between British High Commissioner Sir Henry McMahon and Sharif Hussein of Mecca. For over a century, there have been competing interpretations of these letters. Arab leaders have maintained that Britain promised an independent Arab state that included Palestine in exchange for Arab support against Ottoman forces during the First World War. British governments, however, have consistently claimed Palestine was excluded from these promises. Dr. Shambrook's detailed research into primary sources addresses this historical debate. Welcome, Peter, and thank you for joining us. Peter, as I was reading your book, thank you. As I was reading your book, I imagined a conference room with a conference table in the middle. On one side is you and George Antonius, the Lebanese Egyptian author and diplomat and author of The Arab Awakening from 1938. Across from you are the historians Eli Kaduri and Yeshayahu Isaiah Friedman, professor of history at Ben Gurion University in his time. I believe I recognized Kaduri and Friedman's names as belonging to a list of Jewish scholars who have used their scholarship to help craft the Zionist national identity and narrative. In The Invention of the Jewish People, Shlomo Sand discusses Jewish historians who intentionally work to create a coherent narrative to justify the takeover of Palestine by the Zionist movement. They knew, for example, that the Romans never exiled entire populations, but fraudulently advanced the argument that the Zionist movement was merely facilitating the return of Jews to their ancestral home after 2,000 years of exile that they knew well never happened. These were historians who used their scholarship to advance ideological narratives rather than pursue honest academic inquiry. The history of Zionism, as I was taught in my primary and secondary education in Israel, has been described by Ilan Pape as a fraudulent myth. As a historian, you are among those committed to evidence-based research rather than ideological narrative building, which is why your work matters so much. Your book relies on primary sources to expose yet another myth in the construction of the Zionist narrative. You belong with the group of honest historians as opposed to the ones who were recruited or allowed themselves to be recruited for the purpose of crafting a Zionist identity for the new Jewish state, to try to unite migrants who had very little in common with one another, and to provide justification for settler colonialism in Palestine. Your book covers what appears to be British deception regarding the wartime correspondence between Sir Henry McMahon, British High Commissioner in Cairo, and Sharif Hussein of Mecca, the Ottoman-appointed chief religious authority of Islam's holiest shrines. The Arabs have always maintained that in the 10 letters exchanged between 1915 and 1916, McMahon, and I'm quoting, included the Palestine region in the British government's offer of an extensive independent Arab state, in return for the Sharif leading an Arab revolt against Ottoman forces. On the other hand, successive British governments since 1920 and to this day have argued that Palestine was excluded from the area promised to the Sharif. The McMahon-Hussein correspondence isn't merely an academic curiosity, but evidence of deliberate political deception with lasting consequences for Palestinian rights. Despite 24 requests to publish the correspondence from 1920 onwards, successive British governments to this day had always objected to the publication of the correspondence on the grounds that it would be detrimental to public interest. This refusal points to support for Zionism and now Israel. Please help us understand why successive British governments on both sides of the British political divide supported Zionism and now Israel. At the very end of the book, you say that, and I'm quoting, a British government's acknowledgement, however late in the day, of the truth concerning the pledge given by a predecessor to the Sharif of Mecca in 1915 would surely be welcomed. What difference do you believe, Peter, this could make in the context of our present-day circumstances? What is today's significance of the British deception about the correspondence that you researched in your book? And another question I wanted to ask is, if hypothetically Zionism never existed, what do you think would have happened after the First World War? We would also love to hear from you how you believe your book can support our activism for Palestinian human rights and against Zionist settler colonialism. Over to you, Peter. If you can speak to us for about half an hour, and then we'll open the space for questions and for discussion. Is that okay?
Yes, it's lovely to be here. And thank you for inviting me. Just to mention my own background very briefly, to give you some idea of where I'm coming from. I grew up near Manchester in the 1950s, the product of a very English father who had a distinguished Second World War record, and a very Irish mother, the daughter of a lighthouse keeper, Irish lighthouse keeper, who came from a Catholic nationalist background. And my Irish mother was very forensic in her analysis of the British history and English history in Ireland for 500 years. So I grew up listening to two quite distinct 500-year-old incompatible national narratives. So that was the start of my journey. And basically, I spent 20 years with a voluntary program called Moral Rearmament. It's now called Initiatives of Change. And that introduced me to the Middle East and to Egypt and to teaching in Egypt and to the an introduction to the delights and challenges of classical Arabic. I spent a decade or so helping to organize student exchange visits between British universities and Middle East universities. So I had a couple of visits as well into Beirut in 1982, which really, 1981, 1982, during the Civil War, which really affected me very, very deeply in terms of friendships from a lot of different communities within Lebanon. And I walked through Beirut, and the center of Beirut at that time was like Gaza is now. Okay, and I, apart from a lot of tears, I also realized much more deeply that the importance of history and the fact that the civil war in Lebanon didn't start simply, in 1975, but it went back to certainly went back to 1920, and the installation of the French in the region, and so on and so forth. And so the importance of history really hit me in the 1980s. So I then spent basically 9 years at university, mostly, and I did 3 or 4 years research in the French archives in the 1990s. And I studied in detail how the French administration, the mandatory French administration, had kept control of the Damascus nationalists during the 1920s and 1930s, at the same time as we British had control of Palestine and Iraq, Jordan, Egypt, and so on. So coming to how and why I wrote the book, in about 2015, 2016, I was asked by some friends in the Balfour Project, which is now actually just been renamed. The Balfour Project is now called the Britain-Palestine Project, but that's something else. Anyway, I was invited to give a talk about Britain and the Middle East during the First World War, and in particular to look at the Hussein McMahon Correspondence, which I did by reading Eli Kaduri and Ian Black and Albert Harani and all sorts of a whole range of literature. And the intriguing thing was that they all talk about the 4 or 5 promises that the British made. The the British promised to the French to start with, or at least to the Russians and the French, and then to the Sharif, and then the British and the French getting together with Sykes-Picot in 2016. I'm sure your listeners, those watching, will know all of this stuff. And then a couple of years later, the British promised the same Palestine region to the Zionist organization. So it's a very well-plowed field, this research into all these promises. And there's obviously a wide range of opinion about Sykes-Picot, the famous or infamous, and the Balfour Declaration, famous or infamous. But the thing I found mysterious was that the mainstream historians like Albert Hourani and like Ian Black, who I have always felt didn't have a particular ideological framework that they were trying to justify and underline, many of them were non-committal about the Hussein-McMahon correspondence and the particular debate in the correspondence about whether Palestine had been promised to the Sharif in the letter of October 1915 from Sir Henry McMahon. And I was not satisfied with this. I did my 20-minute talk, and I said, on the one hand, Kaduri says this, and on the other hand, Abdul Latif Tibawi says this, and so on and so forth. But so that catalyzed me to go into the archives myself. In a nutshell, I did not go into the archives in 2016 in order to look for double dealing or perfidy or deceit or anything. I just wanted to. It was just detective work. I just wanted to sort of see what the Colonial Office and Foreign Office and Cabinet Office records were saying. And the more I read, this was at the National Archives in Kew in West London. The more I read, the more intrigued I became, and quite frankly, for the first year, the more confused I became. So I started with the wartime archives, and I went through as many of the relevant documents I could: the Foreign Office documents, the Colonial Office reports and memos, internal documents, and the Cabinet Office records. And I ended up, fortunately, just before COVID hit, I ended up with 10,000 photos of relevant documents dealing from about 1917 through to 1939. They revealed a huge amount, and there are probably documents still at Kew which I haven't had time to read yet. But the other thing I did, apart from reading as many of the books as I could on the subject, published books on the subject, was I decided to look at the Hansard records, the parliamentary records. In other words, what Parliament, what MPs and in the House of Commons and also in the House of Lords, what they said about Palestine and the Palestine Mandate during the same period, so that I could compare what I was listening to or what I was reading internally, what they were actually saying to each other, and what the Foreign Office and Colonial Office officials were actually, what they were actually advising 10 Downing Street during the period. All the parliamentary records from the 19th century they're online and they're free, and you can look at them. So I went through, I studied on my computer online every single day of parliamentary sittings from June 1916, which is when British officials started talking seriously with the Zionist organization about a possible declaration. June 1916, every single day of sittings, House of Commons, House of Lords, through to December 1939, 3 months after the war started. And it comes to about 1.43 million words, 3 lever arch files, absolutely solid, single-spaced, double-sided. I compared what they were saying privately and with what the government statements publicly about Palestine, and together with memoirs of Lord George and Asquith and various other people involved, and Balfour and Balfour's niece and so on, I put together my book. So that's where my book came from, and basically, the more I went into it, after I'd got over my initial year of increasing confusion, as I read more and more documents, I realized the British officials of the period in the Foreign Office and the Colonial Office during the 1920s were very aware, deeply aware that the case that Palestine was not promised to the Sharif was absolutely weak. They didn't have a case to stand on. And having gone through the Hansard records, parliamentary records, I checked that between 1920 and 1939, British government officials in Parliament, they refused to publish the correspondence. They refused 24 times, officially 24 times. And so I looked at the correspondence, and I looked at the Arabic of the correspondence and the English of the correspondence, and it was perfectly clear to me that the Palestine region had been promised to the Sharif in the letter of the 24th of October 1915. It was only in 1939, which is why my book finishes in 39. It was only in 1939 that the British government, Chamberlain's British government, agreed to publish the correspondence, which they did in the spring of 1939. And in the spring of 1939, there was a major conference in London on the future of Palestine. And the reason the British had called this conference was because war clouds were developing over Europe, and Hitler was about to go into Prague. And the British, looking at the maps, they were deeply concerned. They did not want the Middle East and the Arab world and the Islamic world to tip over into becoming allies of Mussolini and Hitler. And therefore, in 1939, in the spring of 1939, Malcolm MacDonald, the colonial secretary, was very keen to placate the Arab world to a certain extent, not completely, but to a certain extent, to keep them from going into the hands of the central powers of Hitler and Mussolini. In other words, they did not want a repeat of the First World War, when the Ottomans and that whole middle region between Europe and India and Australia and New Zealand, where we had huge armies, in India in particular still. So the Middle East was absolutely crucial. The stability of the Middle East was absolutely crucial. So at this conference in London in 1939, the British were asked immediately by the Arab world, please put on the table the Hussein-McMahon correspondence. And the British refused to do that, but they agreed to set up a minor committee. So there was a joint committee set up in 1939 between the Arab world and the British government to look at the interpretation of the Hussein-McMahon correspondence. And they eventually produced a joint report. And in the joint report, the Arabs held to their position that Palestine had been promised, and the British held to their long-time point that Palestine had not been promised. In other words, they agreed to disagree. But the British did agree to actually publish the correspondence. To cut a long story short, the Second World War then intervened, and the British government have never acknowledged or discussed the correspondence since. but the fact is that it's absolutely clear from the documents, from the original documents, that that the British knew they had no case. The Lord Chancellor, who chaired this committee in 1939, said to his colleagues, our arguments are straw. That's the word he used. They're straw. Perhaps just to read out a little bit from the end of my book, just to give some more context for those listening. So I'm just quoting now from the end of my book. Since 1967, a succession of governments in London, their eyes firmly fixed on trade, oil, and regional security, have showed no desire to hold their ally, Israel, a self-proclaimed liberal democracy, to account for its un-Jewish, colonizing, oppressive policies, which therefore remain consequence-free. At the time of writing, this was April 24, Israel's barbaric starve and bomb campaign, military campaign in Gaza, and pogrom policy in the West Bank, following Hamas's terror attack on the 7th of October 23, is not a conventional war, but a colonial-style ethnic cleansing operation. Some of Israel's rhetoric is dehumanizing. There is no parity of esteem, an essential ingredient for successful negotiations towards some sort of pragmatic, reasonably just long-term solution. At the United Nations, the UK government willingly follows the US's oil and empire-focused policy, abstaining Pontius Pilate-like on current proposals for an immediate ceasefire. This is indefensible and inhumane. All the parties involved endeavour to hug the moral high ground, and this is my sort of message of the book. Is it unduly naive to hope that if the British government gave a lead, all might inch forward cautiously towards a settlement on the basis of acknowledgement of their own past and present mistakes, rather than constantly proclaiming from the summits of their self-made moral mountains the sins of the other? What is certain is that the citizens of Israel will have neither security nor peace while the Palestinian people continue to be denied both. The moral and political imperatives for change is clear. Some examples in recent history demonstrate that what is unthinkable today, totally unthinkable today, can become reality tomorrow, when the high priests of skepticism and realpolitik are confounded and a new political dispensation emerges. South Africa and Northern Ireland come to mind, where present political arrangements are considerably better than they were previously. Good acknowledgement, unimaginable at present, and the establishment of parity of esteem, where all parties would be involved in negotiations, be two of the initial stepping stones towards a potential new dispensation for the region, or must the war for Palestine continue for a further century? So I think I might stop there and sort of answer, try and answer a few questions.
That's great. I really appreciate how well you've been able to condense everything into a half-an-hour talk and also link everything to the present, which is really, really good. Does the long-standing historical influence of Christian Zionism have any bearing on why the British government did not acknowledge their promises to the Sharif? Do you know if you can speak to that?
Not very much. Not very much, in the sense that there was, of course, the development of Christian Zionism in Britain with various Protestant groups and so on, including Lord Shaftesbury. It's a well-known, it's a well-known story. And there's no doubt that among the British elite and some of the decision makers at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, before the First World War, there was a certain amount of talk and a number of novels written about the potential, return of the Jews to the Holy Land and so on and so forth. But when it comes to the actual promises, that were made during the First World War, they were all made, it's quite clear, they were all made, the priority of all these promises that the British governments made, the Asquith government to start with, and then the Lord George government after December 1916, they were all made to win the war. They were all made for military strategic reasons to win the war. Now, if the war had been won or lost by the spring of 1915, and it wasn't because of the massive stalemate in the trenches and everything else like that, if the war had been won, say, or lost by 1915, there would have been no promise to the Sharif, and there would have been no promise, I don't think, to the Zionists either, quite frankly. The Asquith government had no inclination to promote either Arab nationalism, that they considered a complete chimera anyway, just hypothetical, basically. And they had no particular, apart from Sir Herbert Samuel, who was in the cabinet, apart from him, there was no sympathy or inclination in the British cabinet to promote Jewish nationalism or Zionism or the Zionist case. And the Zionists, of course, were a very small, minority of the Jewish community in London and in Germany and elsewhere as well. So in terms of why the Balfour Declaration was implemented into and became the mandate policy and the mandate document in 1922. And why the promise to the Arabs was put aside, that is pretty clear in the documents. Basically, to start with, you had a very pro-Zionist prime minister throughout the period to October 1922, David Lloyd George.
Peter, why was he so pro-Zionist, though? We're trying to understand a lot why Britain, even now, is so supportive of Israel, and there's such a historical background.
That's another question. Why Britain is still so pro-Israel? But in terms of promises not kept and promises kept. If you put yourself in what was happening in 1918, 1920, when I say Lord George was pro-Zionist, he was pro the installation of a friendly Jewish community in the southern edge of the Mediterranean in order to protect the Suez Canal. That was Lord George's priority. Okay, and that's what the Zionists promised him, and that's what Chaim Weizmann promised Lord George and Balfour, and eventually Churchill in 1921, etc. That's what they promised. Lord George was not a lover of the Jews. And let me say this. Just let's get back to 1920. Lord George was not a lover of the Jews, and neither, quite frankly, was Balfour. But they could see the strategic advantage of having an allied community, because the Arabs had not, and the Arabs of Palestine and generally had been part of the Ottoman Empire for 400 years. They were not buddies with the British, with the Christian British. Okay, even though the Sharif, for a variety of reasons, had decided to commit treason and to join the British, given the promise of this massive independent Arab state. So which the British never particularly thought that they would ever need to honour. But basically, Lord George and Balfour, it was strategic reasons. It was not because they had any particular sympathy for the persecuted Jewish people from the pogroms or the immigrants or the Jewish community in Russia or anything else like that. There's nothing that I found in the memoirs or the official archives which indicate that the British elite and the British decision makers during the First World War ever had any particular sympathy for the plight of the Jews, either in Britain or in Germany.
You're confirming a material that we've actually covered in other books. It's really interesting to hear you validate that. Have you looked into the Rothschild aspect of the negotiations? I recently learned that the Judenstaat was originally named addressed to the Rothschild, which creates an interesting nexus.
No, I have not investigated the possible or potential Rothschild connection. I found nothing. I mean, there may be documents in the archives which are still classified. It's quite possible that there are a lot of documents still classified which might reveal something or might not. I don't know. But in the documents I looked at, the internal documents of what the Foreign Office people were saying among themselves and the Colonial Office people, there was no mention, there was nothing indicating anything about the Rothschild link, or the only thing I came across was when Lord George invited in a group of Jewish leaders, British Jewish leaders, and this was before the Balfour Declaration this was in 1916, I think, or the beginning of 1917. One of the Rothschilds was in that delegation, and the records show that Lord George had a brief sort of conversation with him, something to the effect that Mr. Rothschild, we have not always agreed on economic something or other, but this is the war, so here you are, and you're welcome to be here, something like this. So, but
okay.
But the thing is that people like Albert Hourani and Avi Schleim and Ilan Pape, who have Arabic and Hebrew and French and so on, they in nothing of what they have, as far as I know, nothing of what they have published have ever raised the question of the Rothschild link. And I think that Hourani and Albert and Ian Black and Avi Schleim and Ilan Pape, if they had found anything in the paperwork from all their archival work, if they had found anything on the Rothschilds, they would have not been fearful about publishing it. And I've not seen anything on that. So
thank you.
For me, it's speculation. But if there was some actual paperwork and evidence, I would be delighted to see it.
How much was Lawrence of Arabia involved or aware of the deception against the Arabs, basically?
That is a massive debate. That is a massive debate. I think he was aware. Personally, I think he was very aware of it. And in some of his letters, he indicates that we've betrayed the Arabs. And then in other letters, he says we did our best, and so on. A bit later, in some of his later letters, he said we did our best, and he maintained a reasonable sort of relationship with Prince Faisal, who had become the king of Iraq during the 1920s. So I've read books which said that Lawrence was an absolute liar in his 7 Pillars of Wisdom, and I've read other books that give Lawrence of Arabia the benefit of the doubt. There's no doubt that he was a rather strange, courageous sort of semi-genius or genius, but personally, I think he knew enough. He knew enough that and he had enough Arabic to read the correspondence and the bits of correspondence that came out in the Arabic press and things like this. And I'm sure he knew exactly what Faisal thought. So yes, I would think he had a guilty conscience.
You were into these documents, and you mentioned about at that time, the early 20s, and obviously this issue about Ireland strikes me in that the British political elite and the military intelligence and all the rest of it, they were clearly aware of the risks of insurrection in these kinds of circumstances, given their experiences in Ireland and elsewhere. When you were reading through all of that documentation, did you get any sense that there was an analysis of where all of this might lead, and in particular, the risks of further ethnic cleansing or insurrection, guerrilla warfare, whatever it was? Because I would have been very surprised if there wasn't some analysis within the UK government at the time that this wasn't going to end in a good place. And it would be interesting for me to know, was there evidence of that they knew where this was going and they still chose to take the path that they chose?
Good question.
I would say the documents, the British documents, and the British it was Colonial Office documents mostly, because Lord George handed the responsibility for Palestine to Churchill and to the Colonial Office, from the Foreign Office to the Colonial Office in February 1921. During the 1920s, the 3 or 4 men, and they were all men, who were responsible for the Middle East desk at the Foreign Office, a man in particular called Sir John Shuckburgh, who was the man responsible from 1921 through to 1931, I would say they felt reasonably comfortable that they could manage the situation, and provided they kept the Arab the Arab nationalists in Palestine relatively weak, the British position would not be deeply questioned. I think after the 1929 riots and difficulties, and then you had the Hope Simpson Commission and so on in 1930, things became a little more questionable. And then I would say by the mid-1930s, yes, the British were getting seriously worried about the possibility of an insurrection. And in fact, one of the High Commissioners, a man called Sir John Chancellor, who was the High Commissioner around 1930, 1931, he told the Foreign Office and the Colonial Office very clearly that unless Palestinians are allowed to take an increasing part in their own government, and we allow elections and so on, and the Balfour Declaration is modified, there will be trouble. And he said this. And for his pains, he was removed pretty sharply. And another High Commissioner was brought in who agreed to and was quite happy to maintain the mandate, what we call the mandate policy, the British mandate policy. When the Arab revolt and the general strike started in May 1936, then of course the British became, yes, a lot more agitated and irritated and wondering about quite what would happen. And I remember there was a Foreign Office official, and I've forgotten his name now. I'm losing names. There was a very senior Foreign Office official who said in 1936, when the many more Jews were suddenly Jewish refugees were fleeing, desperate refugees were fleeing from Germany into Palestine. He sent out a memo saying, if this continues, if this Jewish immigration continues, there will be a Jewish state in Palestine. And this was in 1936. Yes, the British basically thought they could manage the situation, and in fact, even in 1939, after they had brutally suppressed with Montgomery and others, had brutally suppressed the Palestinian rebellion, they still reckoned that they could hold on to Palestine. In 1939, because I've read the French records as well, many of the French records. In 1939, I would say the British government and the French government both planned to stay in Palestine and stay in Lebanon and Syria. Yes, I mean, and then obviously the Second World War took place, and everything changed. But basically, it was they thought they could manage, and Palestine was very important to them because of the Suez Canal. And remember, India was not yet independent during the Second World War. So the Indian Army was very, very, very important, and the Suez Canal, in order to bring Indian troops through the Suez Canal to Europe, was a major military factor.
It is said that the Balfour Declaration was more the handiwork of Theodore Herzl and co., and less of Balfour. How true is this? And that's how I was also educated. Was in Israel, we studied two types of history, and they also had two types of history departments at university, one general history and one history of Jewish or Zionist history. We study Zionist history as a separate topic. And we were always made to believe it wasn't a great charity on behalf of the Brits, but because of the efforts of the Zionist movement, this is why we got it. You know, we got the Balfour Declaration. So this person is asking a fair question. I mean, is it true? Is this narrative correct that it's really the Zionists just did a really, really, really good job, and it's not because of Balfour at all?
The Zionists did a good job. There's no doubt about it. Chaim Weizmann was an amazing lobbyist, and his influence was crucial, I would say. Even though they were a relatively small group, the actual Zionists within the British Jewish community at the time were a minority. But Chaim Weizmann was a kind of phenomenon, and he arrived in Britain in 1904. He had almost no English. He spoke Yiddish, of course, and Russian, and some French and some German, and he had some Hebrew, but he learned English rapidly. And both Balfour and Churchill were MPs or trying to be MPs in the Manchester area where he settled, because he became a lecturer in chemistry at Manchester University. And he met them, and he was introduced to them by the local Conservative chairman from Manchester. By 1914, Weizmann was on speaking terms with half the British cabinet, including Lord George, and he had contacts in the Foreign Office and so on. Now, a man called Sykes, who was one of the advisors to the British government, Sir Mark Sykes, started talking with the Zionist organization in the middle of 1916. and they carried on their talks, and Sir Herbert Samuel was part of their talks. So a small group of Zionists, including Weizmann and Sir Herbert Samuel and Brodetsky and Solokow and so on, they drafted some sort of statement. Now, in order to understand this sort of statement, you have to go back to Herzl. Certainly, Herzl basically wanted, and he went round to the Kaiser, he went round to the Ottoman Emperor, etc., at the end of the 19th century, looking for a charter, an international law sort of charter, a document, a piece of paper that would authorize them to set up some sort of state in Palestine, in Ottoman Palestine. And Herzl was refused. But in a sense, Weizmann was just following on in that legacy of, and during the war, Weizmann and the others realized that that Britain was the great power that had the military edge, that if it won the war, might provide the protection for the development of a Jewish homeland. Okay, so the drafts of the declaration, of the eventual declaration, it went through many drafts, many drafts. And let me just say that it was not just the British Zionists who were involved, but the drafts went over to America to a man called Louis Brandeis. So the American Zionists also had an input into the drafting of the Balfour Declaration. And I would say there was at least 20 people, at least including a man called Seif and a man called Simon and various other people in Britain, who were involved in negotiating and dealing with British officials, because obviously British officials wanted to make sure that whatever declaration there might be, it would fit in overall with British empire policy, and it would not ruffle the feathers of the Russians too much, and it wouldn't ruffle the feathers of the French allies too much, etc., etc. So, but there were about 20 people involved in it. I don't think Balfour did anything, quite frankly, in the whole thing, apart from sign the letter officially. In the documents, there are two people who claim to have basically written the final draft, okay? And one of them is a man called Leo Amery, who was in the Secretariat of the Foreign Office, and also a man called Ormsby Gore, William Ormsby Gore, who later became the Colonial Secretary. And Leo Amery actually also became the Colonial Secretary from 1924 to 1929. So they both claim, under the authority of Lord Milner, who was in the cabinet, to have done the final draft of the Balfour Declaration. So no, Balfour had, I would say, almost nothing to do with the drafting. It was a combination, and it was the initiative and the push over 18 months of the Zionist organization under Chaim Weizmann. Okay. And of course, then the real key to the whole thing, though, is that the Zionists kept pushing at the end of the war. A whole delegation of about 17 or 18 Zionist British and other international lawyers went over to the peace conference in Paris, and they presented a document which was basically a document for, like a charter for the implementation of the Balfour Declaration. And so there was 2 or 3 years of hard negotiations between the British Foreign Office in Paris and the Zionist organization in Paris over the drafting of the official mandate document, which was eventually emerged as the mandate document of the 24th of July 1922 and was ratified by the League of Nations.
What do you think is the significance today of the deception that you are basically investigating in this book? what is the significance of this today, given the events that we see, the fact that the British government is so supportive of Israel to the point where they're colluding with the crime against humanity, against international law, etc. A few more words, just the last few words on that, the significance for it today.
Okay. What I've been talking about, namely the Hussein McMahon Correspondence and the refusal of the British to honour the promise of Palestine to the Arabs after the war, that is only one element of what I would call the double dealing of the British during the Mandate period. The key to understanding the deceit and the key to understanding the legacy of the Mandate today was articulated by Sir Martin Gilbert, who was Churchill's official biographer and a very prolific Zionist historian. And Sir Martin Gilbert, in a lecture to an exclusively Jewish audience at Ben Gurion University in May 2011, he said this. He was giving a lecture and he said this, and it's on YouTube. He said, the centerpiece of British mandatory policy was the withholding of representative institutions in Palestine for as long as there was an Arab majority. And once that clicks into your mind, everything else in terms of British policy and the policy of all the different high commissioners and British government policies, where they weave left and right and all over the place, but their policy in terms of land sales, in terms of Jewish quotas coming in terms of dealing with the constitution, everything else like that. Basically, the whole idea was the British government's unwritten, unspoken, deceitful policy was to maintain a completely helpless Arab majority in Palestine until there was a Jewish majority. After that, in 1939, the British were thinking, well, we'll win the war, and after the war, if the Jews have become a majority, then we will allow the development of local legislative assembly, and they'll have a similar sort of projection as did Iraq and Jordan and Egypt and so on.
Thank you so much, Peter. It's been absolutely fascinating, and I'm so grateful to you that you've joined us tonight, and we did this one-off meeting about your book. Thank you. I apologize to people whose questions I did not include. It's just a matter of trying to juggle the amount of time we have. I found it absolutely fascinating, Peter. Thank you so much. Did you want to say one more thing?
Well, just the word that if people have asked questions in the chat, if you pass them on to me, okay, Abigail, I'll be very happy to try and answer any questions by text, by email. So feel free to give people my email if you wish. I don't mind.
Thank you. There is one particular one.
Absolutely.
I can't see you on the screen, but I hope it's all right. And I think we covered mostly everything. Everybody's very grateful to you. Everybody thought it was absolutely fascinating, and it will certainly help us. The book club on Palestine is based on the idea that in order to be really effective activists, we actually have to know what we're talking about.
Yes, and of course, can I just say, Avi Schleim has just published a book called Genocide in Gaza, which I haven't read it myself yet, but I'm sure is very good. Ilan Pappé has published a book last year, a big book, but it's called Lobbying for Zionism
on both sides of
the Atlantic. And it goes into the whole history. So if anybody wants to really, really, really understand why America is so pro-Israel on the whole, in spite of things beginning to change now slowly, and the same in Britain, the whole Israel lobby in Britain, all the way up to what I call the crucifixion of Jeremy Corbyn. You know, Ilan Pappé's book is really worth going into.
Thank you so much, Peter. If you were in a room with us, we would all be clapping to you right now. So consider yourself clapped.
Thank you. Well, thank you. We just
thank you, everyone.
Never give up. as Bruce Springsteen says, I'm a fan of Bruce Springsteen, and I always remember his song, "No Retreat, No Surrender." So we just keep going. We just keep going, Abigail. That's what we do. We just
have
keep
to.
going.
We have no choice. It's looking very, very bad right
Yeah,
now.
very, 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 very bad at the moment.
But
Yeah,
understanding so much of the context of today's events, it's really important for us that the things don't just appear out of nowhere. There is a long history to them.